Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 5th of December 2011, the podcast that travels in time at a rate of plus 1 second per second. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's line up for inspection the news of the bogus. Emma Sullivan, a Kansas high schooler, learned a very important lesson about government infringement on our liberties when she made a joke about Kansas Governor Sam Brownback in a tweet that said, quote, "Just made mean comments at Governor Brownback and told him he sucked in person. Hashtag he blows a lot." Despite the fact that she didn't actually make any such comment to the governor, and it was just a joke between her friends, the governor's office called her school. Sullivan was scolded by officials at her school and ordered to give an apology, which she, to her credit, refused to do, and even said she'd do it again. Meanwhile, because of news coverage of this event, the number of people following her on Twitter went from 65 to over 3,000. When will politicians learn? Well, maybe at least Brownback himself will be a little bit wiser after having egg on his face. As it transpired, his office apologized to Sullivan, specifically apologizing for the overreaction and affirming that freedom of speech is one of our most treasured freedoms. What if Sullivan had caved and issued the apology? There might well have been no such retraction from the governor's office, and even worse, they might have felt enabled to do this to others who post disparaging comments about them on Twitter. This is how freedom of speech is defended, and Sullivan is to be commended. Here's hoping most of our nation's youth has the same principles and mettle as her. Meanwhile, over in the UK, another student, Richard O'Dwyer, faces more dire consequences because he posted a website which just gave links to content that allegedly infringes copyright. They were links to content on the popular and controversial website, The Pirate Bay. Here's the thing. Under British law, merely pointing to illicit material is no crime. A similar prosecution of the website tvlinks.co.uk was thrown out by the courts because merely pointing to the material doesn't actually make the content available. You're supposed to go against the people who are actually doing it. So what are they wanting to do with O'Dwyer? The U.S. government wants to extradite him for trial in America, even though he's a British citizen with a British domain and linked to a Swedish website. But according to U.S. Government Representative John Jones, he can be extradited because people in the U.S. could access his site. Well, then I guess he could be extradited to any country in the world and prosecuted over and over again. Is this really how things are supposed to work? ICE has already seized the domain name, without due process of course, and in January they'll have the hearing to determine if O'Dwyer can be extradited to the US and charged with something that's a crime in the US that isn't in Britain. But wait a minute, why is it against the law in the US to link to material that might violate copyright? It's not illegal to tell someone on what street you can buy drugs or hire a prostitute, so why are computer links any different? The reason why goes back to our old friend, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and the court decision, Universal Studios v. Ramirez. In this case, the court found that giving a hyperlink to illicit material was the same thing as trafficking in that material, and this finding stood up on appeal. Once again, we see a special and distinct set of laws in place when it comes to protecting the undeserved profits of an archaic corporate cartel and their outdated 20th century business model. So sadly, O'Dwyer might actually be found guilty in the land of the free. When will we wake up? This also mirrors something we covered back in July, where U.S. senators tried to go after a British newspaper for bribing British officials. Once again, we see the U.S. government trying to break down jurisdictional barriers and become a global empire. Here's hoping the British courts do the right thing and refuse to extradite O'Dwyer, but in any event, it's one more example of how the U.S. is becoming a government of, by, and for the corporations, not the people. Alert the Occupy movement, this is the kind of thing they should be protesting. Congress wants to do all sorts of things to help our children, like make sure they eat their vegetables. They just have their own wacky bureaucratic ways of doing it. In this case, they're wanting to reclassify pizza and French fries as vegetables. Their argument is that the tomato paste on the pizza makes it a vegetable. This mirrors the laughable attempt back in the 80s by the Reagan administration to classify ketchup as a vegetable. Of course, all this was done at the behest of the companies that produce the small rectangles of flavored cardboard that laughingly pass for pizzas in our schools, as well as the potato-growing states. Once again, we see that what is purportedly being done to help our children is really being done for the sake of corporate profits. This is just one more example of why the federal government shouldn't even be involved in this to begin with. Why not leave the decision to the individual school districts? It's a lot cheaper and more effective to lobby the clowns in Washington than to lobby the thousands of school districts in the country, especially since parents tend to have a better voice with their local school boards than they do with Congress. It's time for parents and everyone else who cares about our children to stand up to the politicians in Washington and say, "Stop trying to be helpful." And in case you're thinking that our system's preference for corporate profits over eating healthy is just an isolated instance, consider the case of Bo Muller-Moore, who runs a small business with his website, eatmorekale.com, where he prints t-shirts with the slogan designed to encourage people to eat healthier. But now, the corporate giant Chick-fil-A is trying to take him down because they think he's infringing on their trademark, Eat More Chicken. It's times like this when I wish Chick-fil-A's chicken weren't so good. It should be said, Muller-Moore is just a small businessman who thinks people should eat healthier. According to his website, this all began when a couple of his friends had him make t-shirts with the slogan. He delivered them at the local farmer's market, and it went viral from there. Muller-Moore says his business is about encouraging people to eat healthier, and kale is a vegetable that grows in cold weather and can be produced around the world in environments that are inhospitable to growing many other vegetables. He says it's also about supporting small businesses and local farmers. He has a petition on change.org to stop Chick-fil-A from blocking his trademark application. But the sad fact of the matter is, in a way, Chick-fil-A are themselves victims here as well, because they have to operate in a system where the copyright and trademark rules are, quite frankly, insane. If they didn't at least act against people like Muller-Moore, whether they really thought he was infringing or not, whether they even wanted to win or not, they might very well lose their trademark to their own slogan. It's silly, it's ridiculous, but if they didn't go after the small fry like Muller-Moore, who wasn't really infringing, then they might lose their ability to go after big competitors such as McDonald's or Burger King if they engage in actual infringement. But since a change in this absurd system seems nowhere on the horizon, for now all people can do is apply pressure against Chick-fil-A and make it so the consequences of going after small businesses are greater than the consequences to their trademark. A victory here might help small businesses everywhere. And now it's time to decipher the incoherent insanity of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. It seems like President Barack Obama puts himself in the running for this title every time he opens his mouth. Case in point, remarks he made at the Asia-Pacific Economic Corporation Summit. The fail, like a battering ram, comes long and hard, so let's take it one boneheaded statement at a time. The remarks came after he was asked about impediments to investment in the United States. Obama responded, quote, "I think it's important to remember that the United States is still the largest recipient of foreign investment in the world. And there are a lot of things that make foreign investors see the U.S. as a great opportunity: our stability, our openness, our innovative free market culture." Here's some basic economics. If two countries trade goods, they're trading in different currencies, and the goods they exchange are balanced out by the exchange rate between those countries. But if one country invests in another, the other country gets what the politicians and news media like to call a trade deficit. They're not exporting as many goods as they're importing, using the exchange rate as a measure. Economists, however, call this net foreign investment, and they're exactly the same thing, dollar for dollar. The exact same thing is being measured in both cases. Net foreign investment is a trade deficit, and vice versa. Obama, like most liberals, bemoans the trade deficit and even put into motion a trade deficit reduction plan. But this necessarily reduces foreign investment as well, since net foreign investment and the trade deficit are the exact same thing. Now here's Obama talking about how important it is to have foreign investment when he's been actively working to stifle it. Either he's too ignorant of basic economics to see the contradiction, or he's a lying gas bag. Obama went on to say, quote, We've been a little lazy, I think, over the last couple of decades. We've kind of taken for granted, well, people will want to come here, and we aren't out there hungry selling America and trying to attract new business into America. Speak for yourself! There are lots of businesses, small and large, who would love to attract foreign investors, or even domestic investors, who aren't able to because of government fiscal and monetary policy that Obama himself supports. Once again, we see Obama taking action and bemoaning the results. It'd be nice if he'd recognize this and change his policy, but it's clear that that's not at all likely to happen. Obama brings the fail home. Quote, "Because of our federalist system, sometimes a foreign investor comes in and they've got to navigate not only federal rules, but they've also got to navigate state and local governments that may have their own sets of interests. Being able to create, if not a one-stop shop, then at least no more than a couple of stops for people to be able to come to the United States and make investments, that's something we want to encourage." So, Obama recognizes that it's government regulation that stifles investment. The Code of Federal Regulations was an immense 160,000 pages in 2009. It was only 1,000 pages when Jimmy Carter took office. State regulations just add to the quagmire, yet Obama says nothing about this or about his own role in making the current regulatory burden so immense. The solution is to get rid of the regulations. Most of these regulations do nothing towards the purpose for which they were ostensibly passed, but each and every one of them favors big corporations over smaller businesses and makes it more difficult for both foreigners and Americans to invest in our economy. Once again, Obama is all hot air with no solution in sight. It's one thing to spew out misinformation. It's another thing to do so while actively acknowledging what the real problem is and refusing to do anything about it. And that puts Obama to the front of the pack as this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to just stare slack-jawed at this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. In the last podcast, we posted the absurd story of the FDA claiming that walnuts were drugs and that the sellers of walnuts couldn't inform their customers of the scientifically established health benefits without going through FDA drug testing. One thing you should never do with government bureaucracy is assume it can't get any stupider, because some other bureaucracy will come around and do just that. Case in point, the European Union, which officially banned water manufacturers from making the claim that water can prevent and cure dehydration. Yes, anyone who sells water in Europe can get into serious hot water with the Commission if they make the claim that water can rehydrate you. And the really sad part is, this is the result of a 3-year investigation in which they concluded that there was no evidence to support the claim that water rehydrates. All of this would be news to the NHS, which states outright that drinking water can help avoid dehydration and recommends drinking 1.2 liters a day. It's also news to WebMD, which says that to prevent dehydration, quote, "Drink plenty of water before, while, and after you are active." And drink plenty of water before, during, and after exercise. And it even says, quote, "Take a container of water or sports drink with you when you exercise and try to drink at least every 15 to 20 minutes. Heck, any nurse or emergency worker will tell you that the best way to avoid dehydration is to drink plenty of water, and that the first treatment for dehydration is to drink water. It's standard medical practice. It just goes to show you that you shouldn't be relying on any government bureaucracy to give you advice on what's good for you, much less make laws about it. Because otherwise, you'll one day be faced with the reality that the laws that govern what you eat and drink were put into place by this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this verisimilitudinous edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Philip K. Dick. Today, we live in a society in which spurious realities are manufactured by the media, by governments, by big corporations, by religious groups, political groups. Unceasingly, we are bombarded with pseudo-realities manufactured by very sophisticated people using very sophisticated electronic mechanisms. I do not distrust their motives, I distrust their power. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.